Hello, students. As promised, I wanted to narrate a PowerPoint about Aldous Huxley and his theory of vision. So, as you will recall, we began this course with a variety of different theoretical approaches to understanding visual communication, and one of which was called the Huxley-Lester model. And so we've had a bit of an introduction to Mr. Lester. Many of you chose to use his six perspectives as a theoretical sort of structure to do an analysis of an image. And so now it's time to talk a little bit about Aldous Huxley. So I've got a short PowerPoint here, and the first slide says Aldous Huxley, novelist, philosopher, theory of vision. And so many of you are probably somewhat familiar with at least the name, if not his actual works. Here's a lovely picture of a fairly dashing-looking Aldous Huxley. His dates are 1894 to 1963, so he lived to a pretty good age. And one of the things that he's most famous for are his various books. So his possibly most famous book would be his Brave New World, which was written in 1932. And it's one of those sort of dystopian novels about what the future would be like. So he's writing it in 1932, between the world wars, and he's talking about a world in which sort of totalitarian regimes have interfered with the normal functioning of society. Another famous book of his was Eyeless in Gaza from 1936. And then the one that I'm going to be talking about today is The Art of Seeing, which is a very interesting book. And it takes in his theories both of the physiology of sight and of the psychology of sight. And then he also wrote The Doors of Perception in 1954. And if any of you are familiar with the musical group The Doors, with Jim Morrison as the lead singer, it turns out they chose their name, The Doors, based upon Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception, which was written in the early 50s. And Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception was written in response to his experience with psychedelic drugs, particularly LSD. So there we have a different connection to Aldous Huxley from the one which is as the novelist writing about dystopian futures, or the psychologist, physiologist talking about how vision works. And so if you're a fan of rock music, you have undoubtedly heard of The Doors. You might enjoy The Doors. And they chose the name for their band based upon the fact that Aldous Huxley was an early experimenter with LSD. And I am confident that several members of the band The Doors also were probably experimenting with LSD probably about 10 years after Huxley himself was using it. So when it comes to how vision works, the physiology and the physics of vision, Huxley was mostly wrong. Okay, he was nearly blind at the age of 16, and so he followed the Bates method to correct his vision, and he believed that it actually worked. He held beliefs about the physiology of sight that are mostly erroneous. So he had this condition. He underwent this treatment. He felt that he had gotten some success, and that caused him to believe in the theories and the principles of this person named Bates, who had developed this method. And so almost everything that Bates thought about how vision worked was wrong. So the benefit, though, is that Huxley developed theories about the psychology of sight that are closer to the truth. And so his formula for understanding seeing is that sensing, the first thing that happens is light comes into your eyes, you're sensing, plus selecting. And we've seen multiple cases where that is supported, where we don't just take in everything that comes into our field of vision. We pick out the things that we think are important. And there's a long history sort of our evolution about what we think is going to be important. And one of the things that we think is important is something that changes in our field of vision. So one way people have described this is if you're walking around in the jungle and suddenly there's some movement off to your left in the bushes, that could be a tiger. And so basically attending very quickly to changes in your field of vision is a millions of year old survival instinct. And people now talk about some of the consequences of all the new media and how distractible we are. And so you're carrying around with a smartphone and suddenly you get some notification that there was a new tweet or a new email message or a new post to Instagram. And so we're very quickly attending to these things. So that makes us much more distractible than we were in previous times because there's a potential for so much more media input. But the idea that we can be distracted by something new in our field of vision, that is hardwired into our evolution as beings that could possibly be endangered if that new thing in our field of vision is a bear or a tiger or a lion. So Huxley's formula is sensing plus selecting plus perceiving. Okay, so it's one thing to select what you're going to pay attention to, and then the next step is the actual perception. You've got ideas in your head, and you're going to make an understanding or make an idea of what you've seen. That's called the perception. And all three of those parts together are what Huxley says is seeing. So if you think of, what would be the most opposite view of this, and we go back to behavioral psychology, where somehow it's just a stimulus. What comes into our eyes is just a stimulus, and then we respond to it, and it's very simple. And it turns out Huxley and most psychologists since the behaviorists, particularly Gestalt psychologists, say there's a lot more to it than just the stimulus. So if we look then at sensing plus selecting plus perceiving equals seeing, sensing is not the same as seeing. The eyes and the nervous system do the sensing, the mind does the perceiving. So again, there are some people who would think that your mind and your brain are the same thing. And there's, probably a current and recent trend in psychology is what people call the biologization of mind, that somehow it's all biology. Whereas the ancients, going back to Plato and Aristotle, they talked about psyche, that's your soul. So psychology is the study of your soul. So the idea that the eyes and the nervous system do the sensing, the mind does the perceiving. So the faculty of perceiving is related to the individual's accumulated experiences, in other words, to memory. Clear seeing is the product of accurate sensing and correct perceiving. Any improvement in the power of perceiving tends to be accompanied by an improvement in the power of sensing and the product of sensing and perceiving, which is seeing. So one of the consequences of this is my perception depends upon my memory. Well, my memory is possibly rather larger than most of your memories, as I will be 68 this year. And so the idea that when I see something, I am making sense of it based upon all these memories that I have of other things that I have seen. So finally, the major contributions to the theory of seeing. The more you know, the more you see. And early on, somebody in this class commented, well, that's a no-brainer. That's obvious. But although it may be obvious and a no-brainer, I think there is a lot to it. So one of the things that I notice when I walk around, say if I'm walking around a campus, say like Princeton University's campus, where they have this amazing architecture, and I see these buildings with a whole variety of different elements. If I were an architect, I would know the names of those elements. And knowing the names of those elements would make me better able to see them. Somebody else is just going to say, oh, it's got some columns, and they won't notice that there are two different columns on the building, two different kinds of columns. So the knowledge of the elements enhances your ability to see the elements. Similarly, somebody who is a trained dancer, they could watch somebody dancing, and because they have the names for the different dance movements, they're going to see things that I'm not going to see. I'm just going to see somebody moving around. Similarly, someone who is a musician, who could listen to a symphony orchestra, they're going to know the names for the different parts of a composition. They're probably going to be better able to hear the different instruments being played. I'm just going to hear them all at once. So the more you know, the more you see is something that, while it may seem trite, obvious, who would think otherwise. I think there's a lot of substance to it. Finally, the capacity for perception depends upon the amount, the kind, and the availability of past experiences. But past experiences exist for us only in the memory. Therefore, it is true to say that perception depends upon memory. So, in conclusion, when I see something, I am seeing something as a 68-year-old white male, raised in a Christian background, heterosexual, baby boomer, lived through the 60s, Vietnam War, Watergate, variety of things. So I see things today with those eyes, and those eyes are backed up by all the memories that I have. And you see things through your eyes that are backed up with your memories. So I think that's a valuable thing to remember as we try and understand visual communication. The people that you're going to communicate to are going to see in the images that you create things based upon what they're bringing to the image. Okay? So I hope that makes it clear that while Huxley was radically wrong about the physiology of sight, he may have been deeply right about the psychology of sight. So with that, I will close this, save it, and post it to Canvas.